Walton O. Schalick, to most of us affectionately known simply as Walt, received his MD and PhD in History of Medicine from Johns Hopkins University. He has held positions as a clinical fellow at Harvard and has held joint appointments in Washington University's pediatrics and history departments. He is now with the University of Wisconsin, where, among other things, he serves as clinical assistant professor with the Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation and has an appointment as disability studies faculty. Dr. Schalick has edited the Encyclopedia of Disability, published by Sage Press, and a title which was the recipient of the Best Reference Award by the Library Journal in 2005. Dr. Schalick, forthcoming from the Johns Hopkins University Press, and the thing that I think launched probably Walt's love of history, starting as a medievalist, is his forthcoming book from Johns Hopkins, Marketing Medicine, Medical and Pharmaceutical Regulation in Paris, 1200 to 1400. And also his current research interests will yield a book from Oxford University Press titled Cerebral Palsy, a Biography. I heard the subject of today's lecture in Baltimore at last year's AHM meeting and found it fascinating, instructive, and moreover entertaining, and simply had to bring him here to give an expanded version of it. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Walt Schalick as he presents today's lecture, Soapland Symbols, Disability and American Radio 1920 to 1960.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bon appetit while you're having lunch. I'm going to turn the lavalier on. I am really grateful to Mike. He's the consummate host and offers that southern hospitality with a hint of Cincinnati bon vivant. I'd also like to thank the Reynolds and the friends for making this possible. Is that too loud? Reasonable? Okay. I'm going to lower it just a little because I tend to get more animated. And I definitely want to encourage everybody to become a member of the group if you can. It's a remarkable collection. Lister Hill is a phenomenal library. And I should say thank you to the School of Public Health for this unusual venue for speaking. As you get bored of me, you can just look around the room and find other happy distractions. I'd also like to give a public service announcement since I'm talking about disability today. We have the Helen Keller Art Show of Alabama, which is downstairs, has a remarkable collection of pieces, but you have to see it soon because it's also a sales point, and so people are buying the images. That having been said, I want to transition us to the audio world, and we're going to go on air and talk a little bit about radio and disability in the early part of the 20th century.
It's time now for Johnny Dolan. The count's 3-2 and the bases are loaded, and Ted Williams is at bat. Exciting adventures of a man with the action-packed expense account. America's fabulous freelance insurance investigator, yours truly, Johnny Dawes. Where you say you live? Right outside Birmingham, place called Shade Mountain. Expense account item 2, $107, air transportation, Hartford to Birmingham, Alabama.
So, Johnny Dollar, anybody here ever heard the Johnny Dollar shows? So I've heard hours and hours and hours of them for this project, and he was one of the most popular voices on the radio for really the center point of the 20th century. He is famous for these, he's an insurance investigator who go around and investigate insurance claims and scams, and the trope was his expense account. And so at each point in the story, he'd make another transition and say, expense item $5 for a cab from here to Atlanta or something like that. But interestingly enough, the airfare is not remarkably different from today, even with the elevated costs going on with with price of fuel, I promised Mike at one point or another that I would not add my account the same way, my expenses the same way Johnny Dollar would do. But radio, and the other great thing about Johnny Dollar is he went almost everywhere. So anywhere I can give this talk, I can always find that he did something in Birmingham or where have you. So this talk is part of the backdrop for a much, much, much larger project. So Mike very kindly mentioned two projects that are coming out, one on medieval work, which I trained as a medievalist, and then another on the history of cerebral palsy. This is part of an even bigger project that looks at disability in children over the past 2 centuries. And it looks at it in the United States, but also in Western Europe, in France, Germany, and the UK, because in many ways these 4 countries exchanged ideas very readily throughout the 200-year period. Most of what I looked at heretofore was associated with the scientific concepts, the medical concepts, the clinical experiences, and the policies associated with kids with disabilities. But as I did so, I recognized that I could not ignore the wider cultural impact of disabilities and kids. Ultimately, I'm trying to use this historical background in order to understand many of the challenges that we face today in caring for, supporting children with disabilities and their families. And one of the arguments I make in the overall project is that a social effort in engaging with kids with disabilities alters the views of people with disabilities in general, and in particular adults with disabilities. And this is a principle that is really not well understood. The way to see the propagation of that argument is to look at cultural exchange. And so we're going to be examining radio today, but this forms one piece of a wider cultural lattice that I'm trying to understand, ranging from newspapers to comics, film, TV, and literature in general, both children's literature and adult literature. And we'll talk more about the lattice towards the end of the discussion. The radio piece came out of my examination of comic books. For better or worse, I'm sure I'll be paying the therapy bills for the rest of my life. I got my 6-year-old daughter interested in comics, in part because I was trying to expose her to what I thought were strong female characters. So we started with Wonder Woman, which turns out to have been a huge mistake, because in early Wonder Woman comic books, she's both strong and weak independently. So again, psychologists are going to love me for a very long time. But as I was going through comics books with her, I recognized that there were so many characters who had disabilities. And this is a sequence from the early X-Men comic books in which Professor X is a wheelchair user because of lower extremity impairment, but he has profound mental abilities. And so he has this offset, sort of the superhero character who's also less than heroic in having a disability. And in the beginning, there's a sexualized tension because he doesn't feel every inch demand to be able to have an amorous relationship with one of his, ironically, students, which in a university should be taboo. We're not going to go there. But what became intriguing to me as I began scratching the surface was that there were some interesting parallelisms between disability in this fictional world and disability in the real world. So this is, as far as I know, the only image of FDR at the White House in his chair. And these parallelisms spoke to me because they were reverberating through the cultural consciousness and carrying disability in different directions. And then I began to recognize that, in fact, disability was quite common in comic books. So Iron Man, who's now been reinvigorated in movies, is a prototypical figure of this tragic, heroic character who has a disability. In this case, he's an arms manufacturer who sustains a chest wound while touring Southeast Asia and becomes dependent upon his technology in order to stay alive. And when he first dons the equipment, he loses his balance, he's stumbling, rather like a person going through rehabilitation. He then becomes this great, powerful, heroic figure, but always with the feet of clay, harkening back to the world of polio, in which, as comics generated by people with polio, illustrated the tension of you're capable and able with technological assistance, but you're also a little bit unsure of yourself. And again, downstairs is a wonderful image of the Iron Lung, which was very much like Tony Stark's, that is Iron Man's chest protector, which kept him alive and had given greater capacity. Children loved this stuff in the 60s. These images were doing the 60s, 70s, 80s, and still today. And as they often lived in iron lungs for long periods of time, and this is the only image of the back of a four-child iron lung I've been able to find, and it reminds you of teddy bears and dolls and so forth. These are still children who live a children's life. As they experience their disability and then see disabled characters, there is a curious interface between this cultural medium and the experience of disability that goes out. The radio transition occurred as I was looking at this image of Robin, who was a character invented to try and bring younger reading audiences into comic books. There's one episode in which Robin becomes temporarily blind, or in fact, feigns being blind in order to catch the bad guys. And the issue right before this is one in which Robin plays a disc jockey at his local school. And I began to wonder about it was a very popular episode, I began to wonder about the relationship between comics and disabilities. Was there a juxtaposition, not just in terms of chronology and sequence, but actually something more intrinsic? And as I looked more widely, even in comic books, this is an episode of Batman in which a strongman in a circus has an induced psychosis because of the frequency of a local radio station. Every time the radio broadcasts its call sign, he has a psychotic break and becomes this homicidal figure. So radio could be disabling as an experience in the comics. Just to give you the broader technological background so we have some sense of where we're going, Marconi does his initial long-range wireless work in 1895. It's followed on quickly by some of the grand figures in technological design, including Edison and Tesla. The first formalized AM radio broadcast takes place on Christmas Eve in 1906. We're still good, right? And then the first news program occurs in 1820, so we're talking 14 years later. And yet, by the 30s, FM is appearing, although it's intriguing that FM in the early days conveyed not radio broadcasts, but TV broadcasts. And then eventually TV took over its own frequencies. And then by the 1940s, with commercial television expanding, radio experiences a shift. Is it going to be the dominant medium or not? But especially during this early period, it becomes an acceleratingly important medium for cultural experiences. It also becomes a tool. Probably the most famous example of radio as a tool, as we convert from tubes to transistors and beyond, is in politics and FDR's fireside chats. This becomes a one-stop shop for one individual or a small group of individuals to communicate with potentially the entire country. It's a game changer, rather like television was in the JFK and Nixon debate and beyond. And for FDR, this was a way of engaging those people, at least titularly, he said he was responsible to. That is his board of directors. And it also became a mechanism by which he conveyed the importance of disability and children with disabilities. So in 1930, Hoover convened, 29 going to 30, Hoover convened a White House conference on children. That conference had been started by a senator from Michigan in order to focus exclusively on the needs of children with disabilities, and that was largely for family and personal reasons. Hoover had said, we're not going to be able to only focus on kids with disabilities, in part because of eugenics concerns and so forth, but 25% of the conference was dedicated to the topic. And FDR carried forward that standard. And you got to remember, Hoover was known as the children's president before he was known as the guy who ushered in the Great Depression. But FDR became more intrinsically associated with kids with disabilities, in part because of his polio, but in part because of his focus on carrying this standard forward. So in 1934, he held one of his fireside chats
and emphasized that medicine could make a difference in restoring to useful citizenship, that is, to membership in society, children with disabilities, and that if we all gather our resources, we can help make that process occur. And he instantiated that in the Social Security Act of 1935 in Title V, which generated an enormous amount of tax revenue for the care of children with disabilities all across the United States. But that's another talk altogether. So radio, from some of its earlier days, in the real world, was connected to kids with disabilities. But the lived experience was even more complex. So this is a set of oral histories around listening to radio from the 20s to the 50s. And Owen Lyons remembered his father in their small town in Missouri. His father was a Cardinals fan who were the former world champions. They almost were again this year. You can tell I was in St. Louis for a little while. His father really wanted to hear Cardinals baseball, and so he bought an Atwater Kent radio with some effort, set it up for the family, and they would listen to baseball games. But after the baseball game, there'd be something else to listen to, something else to listen to, and on and on. Radio became a partially invited guest who never went home. Radio became the new family member who would be on while you were eating dinner, on while you were eating lunch, on while you were getting ready for bed. It became the fifth member of the family. And so from music to news, from entertainment to sports, radio became a strong cultural feature of families in the early part of the 20th, the early mid part of the 20th century. And it also expanded the geographic horizons for people. So small town in Missouri where most people had never lived beyond the boundaries of the town, you were now learning something about New York City, about Denver, about Texas. And medical history was also there. So there were advertisers who were selling, for example, snake oil almost nationwide. And disability would become part of that world as well. Part of radio's power was that it could cross huge distances in almost any sort of circumstance. So the Atwater Kent radio was surer than the mail, unlike New England right now, which is suffering from both sandy and sequences of snow. Radio would get you through. And that meant that people had wider experiences of disability than they might have had within their own family or their own community. This from a newspaper in Milwaukee. I beg your indulgence, gentlemen, while Mr. Gehrig of the Yankees is at bat, Lou Gehrig, MS, would become a lived experience for people as they listened to this heroic character leaving the Yankees and going through his own trials and tribulations. It could also, though, be a liberating experience for individuals with disabilities. Again, Owen Lyons Jr., remembering that his grandfather, also in a small town in Missouri, got his own crystal radio kit that he made from scratch and listened to things because he was a semi-invalid and couldn't get out. It was a way of overcoming perhaps the stigmatization, but certainly the isolation that disability could create for people. Now, radio at this time was expanding geometrically. If you look at 1923, this is a distribution of radio stations throughout the country with variability certainly in different parts of the country. But there would be a profound growth of radio for families and for companies, even in the midst of the Depression. So we see a slowdown in the number of affiliate stations in the early part of the Depression, but again, geometric rise towards the end. And in large measure, this was because even though there was an initial dip in advertising expenditures, it was nothing like what was happening in the newspapers because radios were a single point of expense for a family. You buy the radio, and as long as you could maintain it, cost over with a little bit of electricity. Unlike a newspaper which required either a subscription or ongoing costs. This was a one-time sunk cost that a family could experience and then continue to enjoy and enjoy and enjoy. And it was transformative in a way that the telephone was not because of that ongoing expense. So this, just before the Depression hits, just a minute, dearie, until I shut off Herbert Hoover on the radio, radio becomes a possibility of entering that next step in the middle class experience, as opposed to the wealthy. And so if you look at the number of homes having radio, they begin to surpass, even as we enter the Depression, the number of households that have telephones, which in fact sinks because of the ongoing expenses associated therewith. And similarly, you see, in fact, radio doesn't, while it sees a decline in registration, in ownership, in terms of acceleration, it never falls below zero, whereas car registration, for example, drops in the early part of the Depression because people can't afford to run their cars. What we're seeing then is an early, profound mass media that provokes advertisers and producers of content to look for new content that will grab hold of listeners who are increasing in huge numbers. And so you see a dramatic rise in the variety, if you'll forgive the pun, of kinds of entertainment and experience on the radio. And disability will be part of that story. As advertisers want to track how valuable their investments are, you see also a radical change in the nature of rating systems. So we have just the barest sense that the Maxwell Showboat is the most popular radio show in 33 to 35, but you can see that there was actually a deepening sense of how comparatively popular different shows were, and that also entailed a variation in the kinds of production that was done. So where did people find inspiration for new shows? Well, in fact, they found it in that cultural lattice. Crossley made a wonderful set of radios that masqueraded as books. And it was an ironic kind of technological masquerade because, in fact, it was happening to the content as well. So if you look at the source of radio shows, it came from books and short stories, from novels and novellas, but it also came from movies. So when Casablanca is created, a radio version of Casablanca is created too. When the Maltese Falcon is created, a radio version of the Maltese Falcon is created as well. Comic books and comic strips in the newspapers generated and engendered radio shows. Comedy sketches and variety shows on the stage did the same thing. News and documentaries certainly spawned their own iterative processes and so on, and we'll eventually get to soap operas. This is one of the rare examples I've found of a radio show going backwards and creating a comic book. So Mr. District Attorney was an extremely popular radio show at one point, and it spawned its own comic version. Unlike Superman, which went from the funny pages to the radio, this one actually went backwards. And it continues even to today. So anybody remember the Boston Blackie? So Boston Blackie was one of the most maligned and one of the most beloved adventure detective radio shows. It's about a wealthy, shady character named Boston Blackie who's constantly mixing it up with the really bad guys. And this year in February, in Soapland, Michigan, they actually put on a stage play of a radio version of Boston Blackie. So again, we're seeing a lot of back and forth between this cultural lattice, which will become important in a few minutes. The power of radio for disability was that it could engender disability and it could make it invisible. It could inspire a sensitivity towards disability, or it could take it away. So in the King's Speech, an inability to be able to speak mellifluously could become a disability where it was irrelevant in the otherwise daily life of a king. But for Floyd Gibbons, who lost an eye in World War I, it became invisible. It was unimportant that he had lost vision in one eye because he was on radio and nobody saw it. And his visual capacity, as long as he could read a script in front of him or invent the words as he went along, was irrelevant. Disability was complex in its interrelationship with radio as a lived experience. Now, the way that it could also make disability visible or invisible in terms of the literature, in terms of the content, I think is nicely exemplified by the Maltese Falcon, which is worth reading as a book as well as seeing as a movie. So in the novel, At one point, Sam Spade, the protagonist, the detective, is going up against a young boy, somebody can spell occasionally, who's going up a young boy who's a gunslinger, and he's got 2 guns, and he's trying to rough up Sam Spade, and Sam punches the boy and takes the guns away. And the gunsel is employed by a character played by Sidney Greenstreet, who's just a brilliant character actor, Casper Gutman in the book, and Gutman asks, so what's going on here? And Sam says, a crippled newsboy, newspaper sale boy, took the guns away from him, but I made the crippled newsie give the guns back. That same image is carried through into the movie 11 years later, but it disappears in the radio version. And it, in fact, at least in some of the script notes, it was taken away for a variety of reasons, but disability could be there, and it could not be there. And it's a very complex interplay that we're going to continue to explore. So Nightbeat was a story about a newspaper reporter in Chicago who was on the Nightbeat. He went around Chicago looking for stories in the middle of the night. And he's always involved in an adventure of one sort or another. One episode in 1950 is called An Untimely Death. And there's an error, a filing error, that occurs in a physician's office by a secretary in which a patient is mistakenly given the wrong diagnosis. And in this case, it's a fatal prognosis. Now today, that would be a HIPAA violation, and quite apart from the fatal prognosis itself, we'd have all sorts of regulatory issues that are generated. But in this case, the man's wife takes advantage of the circumstance because the man himself is kind of bored, and his wife is not very interested in him anymore. She has a lover on the side, and she'd like to get rid of the husband. So because of the fatal prognosis, the man becomes depressed, plans suicide, which is in large measure a setup, and he's only saved in the nick of time by this reporter for Nightbeat and the remorseful secretary who is trying to make up for her HIPAA violation. But in this example, we see some subtle and not so subtle disabilities that are entering into the crux of the storyline. So depression, suicidality, as well as mild borderline personality issues, which were disabilities being struggled with at the time in the technical literature, as well as and clinical literature, as well as in popular culture, is a turning point in the story. Most of the radio shows that you can listen to that involve disability fall into a number of categories. Now, all I can say is I've listened to hundreds and hundreds of hours of radio, and I've thought about many different clips that I could throw in here, but they're all complicated because you have to set them up for people listening to them. So just to derive some of the material for you, if you look at the broad category of adventure and detective radio shows, as well as comedy, there was an interesting feature of them. The shows tended to be episodic. That is, there would be one character whom you know, or maybe a couple of characters who you know from episode to episode. The Lone Ranger, Batman, Mickey Splain's Mike Hammer, who would come and be in each episode. But everybody else in the episode was unique. That is, they didn't carry over from episode to episode, which means that there was no longitudinality to the storylines. And so most of those stories took advantage of certain kinds of disabilities like head injuries, traumatic brain injuries, which usually provoke amnesia. And that became the turning point of the story. Detective shows particularly loved color blindness because the bad guy couldn't make a difference, couldn't characterize the difference between 2 colors, and that was the turning point in the story. That's how the detective knew it was, you're the bad guy, because you have color blindness, and so you didn't notice the blood stain or the ink stain or what have you, or you grabbed the wrong handkerchief. Intellectual disability was often quite common because the bad guy was usually not as smart as the good guy. And they were criminal because of being not quite that smart. Or they were criminally insane, and so they were homicidal and so forth. Sensory impairments often occurred in comedy. Occasionally in detective shows, but more often in comedy because it was funny to see the deaf person or the blind person not being able to absorb contextual clues, and it provoked humor. Intriguingly, those very uncommon to see physical disabilities, unlike sensory and cognitive, psychological or psychiatric disabilities, in these genres, unlike soap operas, and that's going to become important in a couple of minutes. So whether you were listening to The Shadow or Sherlock Holmes, and I have to confess this is the only version of Sherlock Holmes, the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce versions of Sherlock Holmes that I like, or The Saint, you would see these kinds of tropes deployed over and over again as narrative turning points. The Green Hornet, Johnny Dollar, would take advantage of these kinds of stories. The Avengers, with Mr. Steed and Mrs. Peel in 1961, had a wonderful story about a computer that sustains a traumatic brain injury. And a group of physicians, surgeons come in, they're all technicians, trying to save the patient from this traumatic brain injury. One of the few characters with a disability who is the protagonist is, again, played by Sidney Greenstreet, but Nero Wolfe. He's morbidly obese, so obese that in fact he can't reach 8 inches to get his bottle of beer or his glass of beer, and that becomes a recurrent joke throughout the storyline. But as I say, he's one of the few figures who the hero actually has a disability, until we turn to the soap opera variety. I will just give another example, this from Mike Hammer, Mickey Splain's character. There's one episode from '53 in which is called The Man in the Wheelchair, in which a gangster asks Mike to come and give him a hand. The gangster is older, he's in fact cardiac crippled, so he's confined to a wheelchair, and he's concerned about his wife's roving eye because of his incapacity as a husband anymore. He eventually dies through a misguided use of Mike Hammer, but he becomes a tragic figure as well as an evil figure. And that's the more common connection that's being made in these kinds of adventure detective stories. So without dragging you through many, many more examples, most of these stories hinge on disability as a kind of narrative prosthesis. So David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder had argued that if you look at literature, so Moby Dick, for example, or Peter Pan and Captain Hook, a lot of literature sees disability as a kind of literary turning point, a plot device that's critical to the development of the story. It also tends to offer a representational power which will disrupt the storyline, the power of the individual. And so disability can be extremely potent that way. My own derivative sense of that in radio stories is that by bringing disability into the living room, the home of most people, whether or not they had personal experiences with disability, they now had much more common experiences with disability. Characters coming in and out episodically or continuously, which tended to, in some ways, normalize the exposure to disability, made it broader, but it also emphasized the abnormality of disability, and I think created a kind of disability creep. That is, disability became much more obvious and apparent to people, but it was also not trivialized, but made more two-dimensional because it was often related to fictional characters in radio and comic books and elsewhere. And it's in soap operas that we see some of those tensions played out the greatest. Don't let your husband leave the house tonight. Soap operas were the grand, non-episodic version of radio in which there were continuous storylines that brought families into the room, into the living room to listen. One of the most popular was a show called Life Can Be Beautiful. They got inordinate numbers of letters, not monthly or weekly, but hourly and almost by the minute because of the popularity of the show. Life Can Be Beautiful became so popular that its acronym, LCBB, became a phrase, LCBB, by which everybody in American culture knew it. It ran from 1938 to 54, not just on one, but on a couple of different networks, and in fact moved around the time settings in order to drive listenership for other shows. It was so popular. It was like MASH or Cheers, or that kind of effect. Every episode followed the same pattern, even though it was a continuous storyline. It would begin with some philosophical or pseudo-philosophical snippet about how to live your life in a positive way. And this was generated mostly by Papa Solomon the Wise, who would read a variety of books in his used bookstore and try and enjoin both his wards, the people who depended upon him, but also his listeners, to pull through, to make it through, whether it be the tragedy of the Depression or the complexities of World War II and beyond. The experiences that the individuals had in these shows involved love, but loss of life, births, and disability. And probably the most in-your-face example of the disability, the female protagonist, Chi-Chi, her 16-year love affair with a doubly disabled lawyer, a gentleman who both had a lower extremity paralysis and an amputation, constantly problematized disability with respect to romantic attachment. So much so that it provoked social commentators to begin to observe on it. So not the detective shows, not the comedy shows, not the news shows, not the variety shows, but the soap operas, that listened to more frequently by women than men, became the object of castigation by male commentators. So Zolotov, for example, in 43, observed that the male animal is not portrayed in these shows in flattering tones. Normally, men are just putty in the hands of designing women. A man on the serials can always be talked into doing anything by a sufficiently persuasive woman, and the heroines of the serials are always persuasive. But this is 1943. We're in World War II. Women are in factories. Women are in traditionally male roles, complicating the gender dynamics in wider society, and it's playing out to some degree in these soap opera serials and provoking male commentators to observe on it. H.G. Webster was a very influential cartoonist in newspapers, and here he shows a seemingly incompetent mother who said, "Oh dear, I forgot to turn off that soap opera before your daddy came home," and now he is made, obviously he's a good fashion, he has a good fashion sense, but maybe not a good shaver, but this clearly masculine character has broken down in a way that only a woman would over a soap opera, because mom forgot to turn it off, and it's confusing the child. Webster's cartoons, in fact, continued to blast radio shows, particularly soap operas, across a decade or so. But it was James Thurber who brought this to an apotheotic conclusion. In a 5-part series for The New Yorker in 47 and 48, it was not just commentary, it was investigative reporting. He went out and gathered a great deal of data to report to his readers on this pop cultural phenomenon. It was republished later in 48, but it emphasized this post-war, pre-war, interwar, and post-war gender anxiety, stressing the fact that, in this case, post-war males coming back with what we would now consider post-traumatic stress disorder, visual impairments, hearing impairments, and physical disabilities, were now less assured of their gendered roles. And the series of stories was accented by the editors by placing it in between, usually cartoons, that would stress some of that anxiety. So the second installment was between these two cartoons, one showing an artist who smoking his pipe with a relatively masculine physique, but otherwise completely uninvolved with this voluptuous female figure. And on the other side of the article was a cartoon saying, "But how can I be sure it will stay a peacetime army?" This man who was not sure about his sense of bravery and ability to carry forward with enlistment. Curiously, the wall poster in the back, "Careers with a Future, Choose Yours, the New U.S. Army," involves radio, and we're going to come to that in a couple of minutes. In a variety of places through this sequence of essays and investigative reporting, Thurber emphasizes the complex roles that are being generated by soap opera, but the most memorable line comes in the second part, in which he argues that the man in the wheelchair has come to be the standard Soapland symbol, this is the title of the talk today, of the American male's subordination to the female and his dependence on her greater strength. Men with disabilities coming back from the Second World War had an enormous challenge reintegrating into society, whether that be in social roles or in work or in their relationships. And it was made very concrete in these soap opera stories, which is I'm going to use now to make a transition to disability and radio in the real world beyond these cultural overtones. So to start out with comic again, this is a comic that was incredibly popular in newspapers, the Nebs. It became a radio show in 1945, 1946. But in this particular installment, the father is castigating his son, who again wears a very big bow tie, that he's doing poorly in school. He's failing arithmetic and not doing well in spelling. And so he's telling the boy he's really in trouble, he's got to go off and do better. The kid runs off and listens to a radio show in which the hero is left in a very complex predicament in which he's been buried by a landslide. You have to tune in tomorrow for another adventure story. And the kid is crying because he's worried about his hero. The dad sees him crying and says, "Oh, don't take my castigating you so seriously. Here, have some money, go run to the movies." And the boy is observing, he's not thinking at all about this odd juxtaposition. He's thinking about how silly it is to cry when this is a make-believe story on the radio, but it seems so real at the time, which conveys some of the power of radio both to children and those beyond, but also the influence of radio as a lived experience. To offer two transitional examples, Webster Edgerly was a proponent of euthanasia and utopianism, but he was also profoundly interested in radio telegraphy, in part because of his lifespan. And he developed a description of a disease that was transmitted from brain to brain by radioactivity, not necessarily by the actual wireless box itself, but radio transmission from one person to another. Now, there are psychotic features here that I'm not even going to begin to retrodiagnose, but he argued that this was a cause of certain kinds of profound psychological and developmental disabilities like idiocy and depression. Intriguingly, the Nobel laureate Upton Sinclair was fascinated by the idea of mental telepathy, if you will, played out in a metaphor, mental radio, in a way like Edgerly. His wife, his second wife, went through a profound period of depression, and he felt that understanding the occult and the paranormal will both help him get her out of that depression, but also presented new features of her mental capacity. And so he explored in a series of experiments in the 20s her ability to be able to receive his own mental transmission by a kind of mental radio. But the power of radio was far beyond this sort of psychological, psychiatric, and paranormal. It was also used physically to help people with disabilities. So in 1918, there was a great deal of concern around the time of World War I about the utility of radio operation as a potential tool for rehabilitation, but also as a need for society. So will telegraphers be needed? Can we train people, men coming back from World War I as radio operators to help give them a job afterwards? And in the follow-up to World War I, radio training, radio rehabilitation was a very small part, but certainly a present part of the kind of rehabilitation technologies that were used. This expanded profoundly by the time we reached World War II, in large measure because of all of those demographic shifts we're seeing in radio ownership and radio use. So Popular Mechanics, for example, in 1947, one among many advertisements appearing at this time, emphasized radio and electronics TV training, this one in Chicago, and it stressed that men with physical disabilities, whether due to war or other causes, this would be an accessible experience for them. Not only would it be accessible, it would be a valuable experience for them. Disability and radios was also recognized as a tool for being able to support psychologically the individual with a disability. So a man with a new physical impairment may not be able to join the track team, but he can become a ham radio operator. And this can in some ways make up for his disability because of his inherent masculine, mechanical, and electrical interests. even though he's not sound of limb and not able to do more viable activities like piloting an airplane, he can go off and do either avocational activities or vocational activities through radio. This could also be a useful venue for sustaining somebody in their course of physical therapy, because listening to radio, just as watching television or reading magazines and newspapers, can be sustaining. It can be distracting. It can take your mind away from the challenges you're facing on a regular basis. And it could also sustain you when you were lonely. If you were left alone in the hospital, if you were left alone in your home, the radio could connect you to other people because of its ability to cross distances and physical barriers as well as social ones. These opportunities became problematized in the 60s, and I'm going to leave it there, as we began to question whether or not television was good for our children, and equally whether radio was good for our children. The father in the Nebs could question whether or not those radio episodes were good for his child who was not doing well in school. Benjamin Spock was stressing that, in fact, that concern, that problematization is unfair, that there is both good and bad to be devised from these electronic media, and the good and the bad can be the same for kids with and without disabilities, just as they can be for adults with and without disabilities. I'm going to just acknowledge this was a piece that came out a couple of years ago. There's still a great deal of interest in wireless media, and I don't mean wireless internet, in radio, not just for children with disabilities and returning veterans, but for folks who have more chronological experience. And this is being explored not terribly far away in Atlanta, as well as significantly over in the UK, where the BBC is still paying a great deal of attention to radio and its effects on wider population experiences. I'm going to close with two sets of points. The first, just as a simple set of conclusions, because radio was in some ways one of the first truly mass media in the United States, the way that it employed standardization, or at least popularization, implied certain kinds of rules or standards which worked intrinsically and complexly with the role of disabilities. And so disability fell into that complex realm, certainly in the early decades of radio, but in an ongoing way today. As it moves outwards, disability became a kind of narrative prosthesis in this new medium. So if you look at Victorian literature, if you look at early 20th century print literature, disability plays a role as a narrative prosthesis, as Sharon and David have argued, but I think it also does so in both simple and complex ways in radio. It was also a kind of signpost, a semiotic for post-war tensions around gender roles and reintroduction of men with newly acquired disabilities into formerly simplified social roles that now became more complex. And it also could be used as a tool for reorienting individuals, children or adults with disabilities, but in a metastable way as we move into Ben Spock's observation. How does this relate to the bigger project? I have to confess, A, I'm really a medievalist, masquerading as a modernist, but B, I'm not really a cultural historian. I'm more a social and intellectual historian, but I can't get away from the import of this sort of cultural medium. I think all of these different venues form a kind of latticework or a field, if you will, much like a particle interacts with an electromagnetic field or a gravitational field, that has a power on the individual. And the individual can move into this field and, if you will, ricochet, interact with these propagators of this cultural field, and then exit or remain in the field, but change the way they see disability as a consequence. Whether they had not experienced disability in their own family life beforehand, which at the time was probably less frequent, or they saw it in a new way, these cultural media changed the way society and the individual saw disability. Certainly the internet has had an even more profound effect, in many ways echoing things we've seen already today. A variety of processes that I've been examining that take place in the four cultures that I'm looking at, Germany, France, the UK, and the United States, play out in different times in different ways, but they play out in different ways in large measure because of these cultural overlays. as I try to understand how children with disability affect the world around them and how the world around them affects the experience of these kids, there is a necessity to understand the cultural palette, to be able to explore that cultural field and understand how the individual and the group behave. I would argue, and I mentioned this to Mike ahead of time, the Americans with Disabilities Act that takes place more than 20 years ago was possible because society was more ready for it. It wasn't just a few people who were able to overturn a completely united culture. The culture was ready to allow the ADA to pass. It could not have passed in 1920. It could not have passed in 1940. It certainly couldn't have passed in 1850. But it could pass in 1990, and the question why, in part, can be answered because of these shifts that occur. It's not just the relative demise of eugenics, it's also a greater familiarity with the challenges that individuals with disabilities have. Whether I call it a chicken or egg phenomenon is hard, and this is why I don't in general like cultural history, but I think that it's important to explore these issues as we try and understand policy shifts and beyond. Certainly through comic books, admiration of those with disabilities becomes a profound piece of the story. The hero has the disability, and the child reading the story identifies with the hero. And so there was a greater familiarization with at least a stereotyped lived experience of disability. But it also, in a challenging way, connects biotechnology, scientific exploration, and clinical medicine, both in a positive, supportive way with the community with disability, but I think brings a medical model of disability more firmly into the popular perception of disability, which is a whole other story. This cultural representation is important. So I'll close with this image. I'm not going to do this to you. I was going to play some of this music, but I've got it bouncing around in my head and have it around in my head for the past 6 months, and I don't want to consign it to your brain pan as well. But in 1981, this was the first MTV video that was shown. A piece by the one-hit wonder The Buggles, a song called Video Killed the Radio Star, the transition from radio's import to television and movie and the MTV generation and now the internet, intriguingly was inspired by disability. So Trevor Horn, when he was writing the lyrics, took his inspiration from Ballard's The Sound Sweep, a piece from 1960, a science fiction story, which is about a mute boy living in a culture that has outlawed music. And he's sent out with a special machine to vacuum up the stray music that's floating about. And in a sewer, he bumps into an opera singer who's a social exile because she wants to keep producing music. And the mute boy can't understand what she's doing. And the interface, the interaction between the child with a disability in this futuristic, strange, socially reconstructed world and the singer provokes the reader to question, where's the disability? Is it society? Is it this individual? Is it the other individual? And a little bit of that is transmitted in the technological change that occurs with MTV and Video Killed the Radio Star. There's more to be said. A little bit of this may come out in the Q&A, but you'll have to tune in next week for the next installment. And I thank you for your attention.